Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're pleased to have Leon Kolankiewicz here, whom I met around 2011 in DC at a meeting on population strategies. Leon is an environmental planner with a career spanning over 30 years across a wide geographic area. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Virginia Tech and a Master's of Science from UBC, where he was befriended and mentored by his thesis advisor, Professor Bill Rees. Leon's professional experience includes stints with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Marine Fishery Service, Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, the Peace Corps, Orange County, California Environmental Management Agency, and as an environmental consultant. He has managed or contributed to over 100 environmental assessments and impact statements under the National Environmental Policy Act on a wide variety of projects, including fire management plans. An avid naturalist and outdoorsman, he has long enjoyed immersion in wild nature, exploring the Appalachians, Rockies, Sierra Nevada, Cascades, and BC Coast Range, including the Inside Passage, witnessing the northern lights and volcanic activity in the Aleutian Islands, and avoiding the jaws and claws of grizzly bears while researching salmon in Alaska. These experiences helped shape his environmental convictions. Welcome, Leon, and take it from here.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate that. The title of this talk is Blame Game: Who or What is to Blame for the Rising Incidence of Destructive Wildfires, also known as megafires. And as Steve pointed out and was in the information put out, I'm an environmental planner and veteran NEPA practitioner. That means that I have managed or contributed to hundreds of environmental documents, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements that are required under the National Environmental Policy Act, better known as NEPA. It is sometimes referred to as the Magna Carta of America's environmental laws. It was passed and signed into law, passed in 1969, signed into law on January 1st, 1970, marking a new decade and supposedly a new era of environmental management in the United States. That is sort of my analytical hat over the past decades. I have also been an advocate, and I particularly felt, especially as I went on in my career, that the population issue was being distanced or ignored. So that's what made me all the more interested in getting involved with it, the fact that other people were sidelining it. So in that respect, I have also been a scientific director for NumbersUSA, and I'm currently serving as vice president for Scientists and Environmentalists for Population Stabilization. Now, when you do NEPA on behalf of a federal agency, such as the US Forest Service, the National Park Service, the US Army Corps of Engineers, you are in essence anticipating or trying to predict what the environmental consequences of a so-called proposed action or project are going to be. And those aren't always negative consequences. A lot of times a proposed action, such as a management plan for a national wildlife refuge, and I worked on many of those, may involve the use of something like prescribed fire as a tool to manage habitat for the benefit of wildlife. So a lot of these proposed projects or actions actually have some beneficial effects, or the federal agency wouldn't be proposing them in the first place. But the idea is to give the public and so-called stakeholders a chance to see what the federal government is disclosing about potential impacts and to weigh in on them. I have been involved with a number of EISs and EAs where the project never did come to fruition because that environmental scrutiny made decision makers decide, look, we don't want to do this. It's just not worth going forward with it. Now, at the same time, I wanted to emphasize that I'm not a fire ecologist, I am not a climatologist, but I have worked with these people and I have read a lot of their work over the years, so I have some familiarity with the topic at hand here. I wanted to spend a few slides going over some of my personal experience with wildfires in the United States and Canada, starting with actually fighting some of them as an undergraduate, working as a contractor or a member of a team for the US Forest Service, fighting fires in the East and eastern deciduous forests, a place where we don't normally think of wildfires even occurring. They are mostly associated, somewhat incorrectly, with boreal forests, coniferous forests, southwestern forests in the United States, etc. But they can and do occur throughout North America. And this is a fellow who is a professor at Penn State University, professor of forest ecology, where I am now based, actually, not at Penn State, but in State College in the heart of the Central Appalachians. And he says here, the fast-moving, wind-whipped blazes that burned more than 150,000 acres in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee in 2016 killed 14 people and damaged 2,400 structures in 2 counties may be a portent of things to come, especially with a changing climate, I might add. Many people have been lulled into believing that it's just the West that is prone to devastating wildfires, but that's just not true. Referring again to some of the experience I have working with wildland fires. For several years, I wrote a number of environmental assessments on wildland fire management plans for the US National Park Service, including one for Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior, a noted international biosphere reserve that is famous, among other things, for the long-standing research done on wild wolf populations on that archipelago of islands. Here I am actually standing on a fire tower, of all things, on Mount Ojibwe, the highest point on Isle Royale, and looking north across Lake Superior towards Thunder Bay, Ontario. And here are a couple of the documents that resulted from that fire management plan for Isle Royale National Park in 2003. Another one, draft fire management plan and environmental assessment for the Buffalo National River in Harrison, Arkansas. That's in the Ozark region of Arkansas. And then when I was at graduate school in British Columbia studying environmental planning at UBC, I got actively involved in the conservation community, environmental community in BC, and began to write about these things. And one of the very first articles I ever wrote for a publication in BC called Whiskey Jack, which styled itself BC's Voice of the Wilderness. And I loved the name for one of my favorite birds in the Rockies and the northern wilds, the Whiskey Jack or Gray Jay, was on the Stein River Valley, an area that I got very involved in trying to protect. It was the largest watershed on the mainland of British Columbia, within 100 miles of Vancouver, that hadn't yet been logged, dammed, or roaded. And now I'm happy to say it is a provincial park, 450 square miles or something like that. It's just west of the Fraser River, and just upstream of the confluence of the Fraser with another mighty BC river called the Thompson, and that's where the village of Lytton is, at least until 2021, when the hottest day in Canadian history, the day before, was certainly tied to a fire that virtually burned Lytton to the ground. And as this headline from the New York Times in 2021 says, heat waves spread fire that quote unquote erased Canadian town. Busloads of residents went to tour the charred town of Lytton, British Columbia this week and found it almost unrecognizable. It didn't look like this when I went through there in the 70s and early 80s. That was the Fraser River behind it there, by the way. And then later on in my life, I actually lived in California, and I've worked Southern California down between LA and San Diego. Was an environmental planner down there. And in 2017, there was at that time what became the largest wildfire in California history at least dating back to, say, 1890. They have very good records on it there. It burned almost 115,000 hectares, destroying more than 1,000 structures in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. That's just northwest of LA. And it burned for more than 6 months. I was actually in Santa Barbara just a month or two before this fire hit. I spent a week there. And in the aftermath of it, 2 or 3 months after I was there, a gigantic mudslide swept down the denuded slopes of the Santa Ynez Mountains, and it claimed 23 lives in the very village that I lived in, Montecito, right next to Santa Barbara, where I had just spent a week a couple of months before. The home of a friend of mine was destroyed just after they'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating this historic home. I knew a couple of other people that had to be evacuated. And this Montecito is where some pretty A-list people live, including Prince Harry and Meghan and Oprah Winfrey. So it's a well-known place, and it was devastated by the aftermath of this terrible wildfire, which grew to the largest in the state of California. Now, throughout this talk, for the rest of it, I want you to keep in mind this triangle here, because it shows the 3 major factors that govern megafires. It's called the megafire triangle. And these are humans, climate, and fuels. Under humans, we have land use and management. We have the WUI right next to megafires there in the red. WUI stands for the wild-land-urban interface. Moving over to climate, we have some of the major cycles that occur with climate around the world, including the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or the PDO, the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, or AMO, and ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and the overall background of climate change, a warming climate as a result of increasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. These can lead to severe drought and extreme weather conditions, which have a major impact on the incidence of megafires. And then finally, moving over to the left side of this diagram, we have fuels. That's referring to organic matter, both living and dead, in the forest, and the pattern, amount, and disturbance history of that organic matter, that carbon lying in the forests. And the long time history in both Canada and the United States, dating back a century more now, of fire exclusion in general has meant a buildup of those fuels, leading also to megafires. So keep this in mind as we go through the rest of the talk, because everything sort of fits in with this framing. Next, I wanted to refer to an important, what I'm going to do is focus on 2 places that I'm relatively familiar with, one more than the other. California first, and then Canada, because that's where a lot of you folks hail from and where I once lived. So this was an important paper published in 2020 in the journal Fremontia by 2 fire ecologists, John Keeley of the USGS and his colleague Alexandra Sifford. It's called Nexus Between Wildfire, Climate Change, and Population Growth in California. And this image depicts aerial retardant being dropped on a chaparral fire in Southern California. Chaparral refers to the sort of woodlands or savanna, smaller trees that covers millions of acres in sort of coastal California, all the way up into the redwood region in the north, from the deserts in the south and the east. So Keeley and Sifford say that even prior to the devastating impacts of the January 2025 Los Angeles wildfires, which wiped out large parts of Pacific Palisades and Altadena, for example, a total of 57,000 acres burned, at least 30 deaths, over 200,000 evacuations, over 12,000 homes and buildings destroyed, and damage estimated, still a wide range here, 57 billion to 150 billion in economic losses, probably the worst disaster in all of California's history. Even before all this, California had already begun to experience a remarkable upsurge in large destructive wildfires. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, twice the area burned compared to the last 2 decades of the 20th century. In other words, the rate of burning doubled, say acres burned per decade. And Keeley and Sifford write, this increased fire activity has been correlated with an increase in average temperature over this same period, leading many observers to assert that global climate change must be playing a major role. Climate models forecast continued warming, and thus some have suggested these catastrophic fires are quote unquote the new normal or quote unquote the new abnormal in the state of California. And they continue to write, in contrast, others have declared that these fires are the result of quote unquote forest mismanagement, and this has stimulated renewed interest in fuel reduction. It's almost as if these opinions aren't even in reference to the same fires, and there is some validity to this assertion, unquote. So they point out in this important paper that California experiences 2 different types of fires, so-called fuel-dominated fires and wind-dominated fires. And each of these types of fires is controlled by different environmental and historical factors. Understanding the difference between them is, quote, helpful for navigating the confusing array of opinions expressed in the media, as well as determining the appropriate management responses to reduce future fire impacts, unquote. So fuel-dominated fires, these are due to anomalous, that is vastly excessive fuel loads resulting from misguided 20th century forest and wildland fire management practices. In the early 1900s, there was increasing interest in timber resources, which led to vigorous suppression of natural fires in forests, what we call fire exclusion, excluding natural or man-made fires from those forests, from those wildland forest areas. These had historically burned at decadal frequency in a lot of California. So in fire management, in forest ecology, we have something referred to as the fire return interval. And that's how often fires return to areas under natural conditions. And it can range from just a few years in drier forests that actually depend on fires to open seedlings, to open seeds, open pine cones, for example, to hundreds of years in some of the wetter forests of, say, coastal British Columbia and what we call the Pacific Northwest in the US. Some of these forests thus accumulated understory surface fuels that represent fuel loads in order of magnitude, that is 10 times greater than historical levels, including saplings that can serve as ladder fuels that carry flames from the ground surface up to the forest canopy, resulting in so-called crown fires. And just a break here, I'm sure these images of posters will be familiar with a lot of you. Word got out in the 20th century, thanks to the US Forest Service and other agencies, that all fires in the woods were bad, right? And that only you could prevent these forest fires. So that the message was presented far and wide, not just among the public, but even among professionals, that all fires are bad and that there's got to be a policy of putting them out because they harm the forest, they harm the soils, they harm ecology, they harm wildlife, and to say nothing of the damage they do to human structures and the threat they pose to human lives. And this was a fundamental misunderstanding that forest ecologists themselves only began to correct really in the latter half of the 20th century. When I was working as a Peace Corps volunteer in Central America, the country of Honduras, in the mid 1980s, the message we were given was that the fires set in tropical rain and dry forests by farmers to get rid of insects, to release nutrients to the soil, that all of those were bad, right? That was evil in essence, and that part of our environmental education efforts were to try and get them to stop setting those fires, what we might call prescribed fires or controlled burns. And that was mistaken. And this was the word getting out there, even among professionals, as late as the mid 1980s. Low intensity ground surface fire is a sort of a typical fire pattern in many Western forests. And this is why there's some confusion surrounding this. The acreages burned before fire suppression began in earnest in the late 1800s and early 1900s was often greater than the acreages we see burned now, but they tended to be ground fires like this. And they were all lightning ignited, and they were commonly restricted, as the text says here, to low intensity surface fires that the trees themselves were well adapted to. You go through a lot of these western forests and you see the scorch patterns, the burn patterns on those tree trunks, and the trees are healthy and well. You see them in the fabled sequoias in the Sierra Nevada up at 8 and 10,000 feet. They are not only able to resist these fires, but as I was saying earlier, a lot of the plants in these areas, in these ecosystems, co-evolved with fires and actually depend on them. Fire return intervals may be from 5 years to 50 or 100 years under natural conditions, even before Native Americans or First Nations began to set fires themselves to help manage forests and increase forage for wildlife, game, and the like. On the other hand, the incidence of so-called high intensity and destructive crown fires, aka stand replacing fires, has increased dramatically in Western forests in recent decades as a result of this anomalous fuel accumulation that eventually, sooner or later, under the extreme conditions that are becoming more common as a result of rising temperatures and greater heat stress and so forth, those combined with the anomalous fuel accumulation are what has led to these so-called conflagrations that have become ever more common. So one way that is widely regarded among all sides in this to try and reduce the amount of fuel, or what fire managers call prescribed burns or prescribed fire, a lot of folks refer to them as controlled burns, or mechanical means, what we call mechanical thinning, and or actually logging, clear cutting an area to reduce that amount of fuel. But this is not without major risk. And this is why it doesn't happen as often as fire managers would like it to happen. There was an infamous incident called the Cerro Grande fire in May 2000 that started as a prescribed fire on the Bandelier National Monument in northwestern New Mexico. Great place to visit. I've been there a number of times as a former New Mexico resident. Unfortunately, it was right near Los Alamos, New Mexico, and most of you probably realize what is found at Los Alamos. This prescribed fire became uncontrolled due to high winds and drought conditions. It should never have been set in the first place. And this one fire and the damage it caused led to changes in so-called prescriptions for controlled burns. Over 400 Los Alamos families lost their homes from the resulting 58,000-acre fire. There were damages to structures at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, although without loss of life and destruction of nuclear material. But it still caused $1 billion. And here you see the plume of it blowing eastward, the prevailing winds across New Mexico, up into Colorado, over into Oklahoma, and northwestern Texas. Yeah, and this fire just lasted a week, as opposed to some of the fires that can last for many, many months in California or in Canada. And here's the aftermath of it. And again, this is an area where fires occur naturally. To see a landscape like this isn't necessarily a negative thing. If fires can get too hot on very steep slopes, they can remove all of the vegetation, leading to the mudslides I referred to earlier in California, and damaging soils, making it difficult to support tree growth and retarding the eventual return of forest to those areas. On a spot like this, you can already see that vegetation and even some trees are coming back. Now, another issue with prescribed burns, this came up in the recent tragedy in Southern California, the LA wildfires this past January. The claims were made that the very politically powerful and connected South Coast Air Quality Management District, I used to deal with them all the time when I was doing environmental assessments in Southern California as an environmental planner there. They regulate air pollution in the Los Angeles Air Basin, and they're very powerful because it was long ago recognized that smog has a major effect on public health in that area. But some people in the aftermath of the tragedy this last January were claiming the South Coast Air Quality, the AQMD, was actually partially responsible for it because they made it very difficult to get the permits to do the controlled burns that would have perhaps limited some of the damage or even prevented it in those within the wildland-urban interface, or WUI, in that area. This is very contested. I just wanted to get the idea out there that these opinions are held and that they're not entirely uninformed. Managing prior or fire-prone landscapes in the WUI, wildland-urban interface, is very problematic for fire managers and fighters. Prescribed fire can be used to reduce fuel loads, but that's often ruled out because of the risk of what happened in the Cerro Grande fire, of the smoke that it can cause, and even the escape fires get in an improper prescribed burn, going well beyond the limits of what they were opposed to, and putting homes like these in Montana at risk. Half of the budget of the US Forest Service in some recent years has actually been dedicated to fire suppression, not the controlled burns I've just been talking about. But there's so many fires occurring in Western forests now that the money that should be going into resource management is sometimes put into just protecting lives and property from those fires, the wildfires or wildland fires. The let it burn option, which is sometimes the best way to go if there aren't lives and property at risk. When there are too many of those at risk, it is no longer an option, right? Here we have an example of a place at Big Sky, Montana, a very popular ski resort where development has proliferated in the last several decades. This is just north of Yellowstone National Park in southwestern Montana. Back to California, I mentioned the fuel-dominated fires that is mentioned in that Keeley and Sifford paper. The other major type that they delineated are the wind-dominated fires that tend to occur mostly on the coast and tend to be the much bigger and more deadly and costly ones because that's where most of California's population is. These are controlled by external weather events over which humans have no control. They can lead to firestorms, high winds and fires that are just pushed along and spread very rapidly by those winds. They occur in Western California and burn largely non-forested landscapes of shrubs, grasses, shrub, and chaparral. Again, the lower drier forest I referred to earlier. They can grow very rapidly, that is, virtually explode sometimes due to extreme wind events and severe challenges to fire suppression efforts. As I mentioned, I used to live in Southern California for 5 years. I never had to deal at that time with fires. We could smell them in the distance, but though I can attest to just how incredible those winds are, which begin to hit about October and can go all the way into December or February. And I think that windy season is expanding. Here you see the plumes going from San Diego and Los Angeles out into the Pacific Ocean. These wind-dominated fires historically affect landscapes that have not experienced fire exclusion despite being managed by the same fire suppression policy. That is, the official policy is to put out all fires, right? Because of the proximity of human structures and resources that you want to protect. But this is because essentially all of these fires are caused by human ignitions, which are relatively common due to the high population density in the western portion, the coastal portion of California. As a result, there has not been any lack of fire, and most of the large fire events are burning across landscapes with an extensive fire history and no anomalous fuel accumulation like you have in, say, the Sierra Nevada or the northern parts of California and more forested regions. I put power lines or just fire transmission lines here because it's not just people with matches or car sparks come from fire from automobiles, but the failure of power lines that often leads to some of these fires. But they're still human caused because it's that human infrastructure that causes it. The role of population. It was Roger Kennedy, a former National Park Service director, who was one of the first to call attention to the role of population growth in raising the threats posed by wildfire. And here you see in the background, I think you can probably see it, California's population growth during the 20th century from 1900 to 2010 or 2020. California's population grew from less than 2 million in 1900 to approaching 40 million by the year 2010 and 2020. Since 2000, California has indeed experienced a highly variable and subtle rise in temperature. However, less remarked upon is that there has also been a steep rise in population, adding about 6 million people over the last 2 decades. Now, in the past 5 years or so, this has changed. Again, this is from a 2020 paper. California's population is still about 40 million. People have been moving out of it more than people have been moving into it, because in many ways it's become dystopian in some respects. Since about 100%, almost all of the wind-dominated fires are ignited by humans or human infrastructure, there is a likely causal relationship between this population growth and the increased incidence of catastrophic wind-dominated wildfires in California. And Keeley and Sifford note, the real driver of wind-dominated fires is not the extreme wind events per se, but rather untimely human ignitions during such extreme wind events. And of course, the addition of 300,000 or more people every year in the state increases the probability of such an ignition event. Moreover, urban sprawl into wildland areas, into the WUI, increases the probability of losses of lives and property. And they give an example of this in their paper of the Tubbs, so-called Tubbs fire. In 2017, this destroyed large portions of Santa Rosa and Sonoma County, figure B in the figure I'll show next, killing 22 people and destroying more than 5,500 structures. Yet 50 years earlier, half a century earlier, the Hanley fire had burned through much the same landscape during a so-called north wind event, but no one died and only about 100 structures were lost. So these two maps compare the two. The 1964 Hanley fire on the left, and you can see the pink area there delineated is that fire. And you see in that same map in sort of yellow, low density housing development and dark red or brown, whatever that color is, high density housing development. And you can see how little of the Hanley fire area consisted of either of those two types of development. On the other hand, 50 plus years later, in the 2017 Tubbs fire, much of that fire was now covered by low and high density housing development. So they note that the difference in impact between these two fires is likely due to the fact that during this 50-year period, Santa Rosa's population grew from 30,000 to 170,000, and its urban footprint had expanded such that in 2017, 2/3 of the area burned by the Tubbs fire was now low-density housing. Again, this is from Keeley and Sifford. And just to go back to this point, because I think it's important to emphasize, the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, is the area where houses and wildland vegetation meet or intermingle, and where wildland fires are the most acute. The WUI in the United States grew rapidly from 1990 to 2010, bit dated, but these trends have kept up to 2020. Both in terms of both numbers of new houses in just that 20-year period, 1990 to 2010, the number of new houses grew from 30.8 to 43.4 million, growth of 41%. And in terms of land area, from 581,000 to 770,000 square kilometers, 33% growth. This made it the fastest growing land use type in the conterminous United States, what we also call the lower 48, that is excluding Alaska and Hawaii. The vast majority of new WUI areas were the result of new housing, 97%, not related to an increase in wildland vegetation penetrating into existing developed areas. Within the perimeter of recent wildfires from 1990 to 2015, there were 286,000 homes in 2020 compared with just 177,000 in 1990. Furthermore, WUI growth often results in more wildland or more wildfire ignitions, because there are more people there and more infrastructure there that can, put sparks into a tinder box, putting more lives and houses at risk. And the authors of this paper from the National Academy of Sciences, 2018, point out that these problems will not abate if recent housing growth trends continue. Now let's move up to Canada. Canada's record-breaking wildfires in 2023, and your government referred to it as a fiery wake-up call. Canada's 2023 wildfire season was the most destructive ever recorded. So again, that's just 2 years ago. By the end of the year, more than 6,000 fires had torched a staggering 18.5 million hectares. To put that in perspective, it's an area greater than England and more than double the 1989 prior record. Normally, there are an average of about 2.5 million hectares of land consumed by wildfires every year. Unlike in previous years, the 2023 wildfires were widespread from the West Coast all the way to the Atlantic provinces and including the far north. By mid-July, there were 29 megafires, defined as those exceeding 100,000 acres each. Some more data. There were fires in all 13 provinces. There were spillover into the northern US, total of over 6,500 fires, 8 deaths, and roughly 200,000 evacuations across the entire country. And that is roughly comparable to how many people had to be evacuated from LA alone in the big fires there this past January, again, as a result of the massive numbers of people that live in the Los Angeles basin. The 2023 Canadian wildfire season had the most area burned in Canada's recorded history, surpassing the 89, 95, and 2014 seasons, as well as surpassing the 2020 Western US wildfire season, which was our largest. So here, you can see this bar chart showing just how far and away 2023 was compared to all other years in recent history in Canada. And just a map showing, again, the wide geographic distribution of those fires, over 6,000 of them. Just a few photos of that, aerial or satellite. This is Quebec in 2023. The hamlet of Enterprise. I find scenes like this just heartrending as one who has spent a lot of time in rural areas and little hamlets like this. Enterprise, Northwest Territories, population 75 after being burned to the ground in 2023. This image shows the horrific effect that it had on air quality for a number of weeks back in 2023. And of course, it didn't just stay in Canada. Well, this shot from Calgary is there, but I was in the Northeast at that time, not in New York City, but in Hartford, Connecticut for a project, and saw conditions like this. Empire State Building in Manhattan on June 7th, 2023. The Manhattan skyline from Hoboken, New Jersey, June 6th, 2023. The Statue of Liberty and the Staten Island Ferry. Of course, all of this is extremely damaging to human health, especially those who have bad lungs or heart conditions, the elderly and so forth. And the 2023 Canadian wildfires were fueled by record high temperatures and widespread drought conditions across the country. The country experienced its warmest May to July period in over 80 years, breaking previous national temperature records for this 2-month period by nearly a full degree Celsius. That's extraordinary. And of course, that laid the groundwork to these record-breaking fires. World Weather Attribution, WWA, is an international group that looks at how climate change affects the intensity and likelihood of an extreme weather event. Their study found that climate change made the extreme intensity of Canada's 2023 wildfire season at least twice as likely as under pre-industrial climate. This is contested by some folks out there, but I think most climatologists and climate scientists and foresters would go along with it. And this is a scene from Alberta in May of 2023. Back in the US, the US Fourth National Climate Assessment, these are assessments done every 5 years or so, mandated by the US Congress, said that changes in temperature and precipitation are increasing air quality and health risks from wildfire. Projected increases in wildfire smoke events are expected to impair outdoor recreational activities and the visibility of wilderness areas. As a wilderness advocate and a lover of wilderness, and one who spent a lot of time there in places such as Canada and Alaska and the American West, Central America, and so forth, being able to see the natural beauty of the landscapes you're in is a big part of the psychic income one derives from that. So we're going to have more and more days where these sorts of conditions prevail for the foreseeable future. Now let's take a step back and look at the mega trends along with the mega fires. Overall, in both Canada and the United States, throughout North America, the population, that is the number of humans, is going up, as is the number of humans, people, and structures being built in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. So that factor is increasing and likely to lead to greater impact of an increasing number of fires on the human condition. The climate is getting warmer and putting greater heat stress on forests and wildland landscapes. That is going to tend to increase the number of megafires. And in many places, in spite of the recognized need for prescribed fire, and as a result of this improvement, I think, in our understanding that in many landscapes, fires are part of that landscape, those continue to increase in many areas. And so that is going to tend to increase the incidence of megafires. Almost done here. Moving up to 2025, we already have a very active fire season in Canada right now. And Canadian forest fire researcher Mike Flanagan says there's a lot more fire in the future, and we had better get used to it. In a word, the future is smoky. The premier of Manitoba said that these fires underway just in the last month or so in Manitoba. This resulted in the largest evacuation Manitoba will have ever seen in most people's living memory. Climate Atlas of Canada. More and more Canadians are living, working, and playing in Canada's forests. That means that more people are likely to be affected by larger and larger fires, even catastrophic ones. And in essence, both Canadians and Americans are going to have to learn to adapt to these realities and mitigate them to the extent feasible, because megafires are here to stay for the foreseeable future. There's a lot that can be done, and it all depends on the specific time and place, but there's a lot more reason to be having to do it. And with that, I'll open it to questions and discussion. Do you want me to leave the share on, Dave?
Well, I don't think it matters right now.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks very much, Leon, for this rather depressing but realistic overview of what we're facing both in the United States and in Canada, because the smoke is certainly coming this way down in the, as far as I'm in Massachusetts, and we've had quite a few bad days already this year. I guess I'll ask the first question because you've mentioned human population growth as one of the three variables. In most environmental activism that I've witnessed over the last half century, population has been pushed to the back burner repeatedly.
Correct.
And I imagine that you've had consistent objections to placing it in your discussions. My question is what are the major sources of these objections? Where do they primarily originate when you get people that try to cut it out of papers or talks that you're going to give? And by the way, Dave Doherty's on next, at bat to be up next with his question. By the way, we only have two questioners and a couple of comments. So you can take your time and how you respond to them, and maybe others will want to comment or ask a question after the next two are done.
Yeah, Steve, thanks for bringing that up. As noted right at the outset, I have been a bit of a population activist. I'm the scientific director of NumbersUSA, an organization explicitly focused on US population size and what the drivers of increase to that size are. And the group Scientists and Environmentalists for Population Stabilization, where I'm a vice president. But I have also been a NEPA practitioner, that is, writing, managing, doing analysis for environmental impact statements and environmental assessments for US agencies. And one of the interesting things about NEPA itself, the statute itself, again, dating to 1969, 1970, the time of the first Earth Day, founded by a late friend and colleague of mine, Gaylord Nelson, Democratic U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, and later a former governor of the state of Wisconsin. NEPA itself was very cognizant of the role of human population size and growth. It was right in the preamble to the act, right? And every NEPA document I ever did has a section entitled Purpose and Need, where you have to look at what the drivers of a so-called proposed action or proposed project are. And for example, 15 years ago, I was the project manager for an environmental impact statement near Great Falls, Montana, on a proposed 400 megawatt coal-fired power plant for a rural utility service, right? As we all know, this was before the climate change issue had become even as big as it is right now. But that was one of the topics, of course, that we covered in this multi-hundred-page document. But in that purpose and need section, you have to look at why do they need more electric power that the taxpayers of the United States should be subsidizing in the form of loans or loan guarantees to this rural electric utility. And in the case of Montana at that time, it was its rising human population. Chapter 1 or Chapter 2 and their purpose and need will come right out and say it. People are consuming more electricity on average, as is industry. That is, the rate of electricity consumption is going up. But one of the main drivers of that in the state of Montana at that time was population. I was a project manager for the US Army Corps of Engineers on the largest proposed water supply dam and reservoir in northern Texas to supply water to the so-called Metroplex of Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, where millions of additional people are projected to live by 2060. And there, in the purpose and need of that EIS for the Army Corps of Engineers, we come right out and say it's the rising population that is causing this need to build an 18 square mile reservoir, right? That is going to get rid of a diminishing habitat in Texas, bottomland hardwood forests. So the documents themselves will often say that it is a rising population and sometimes what the source of it is, but the environmental groups that used to be concerned, publicly concerned, and oppose that population growth are the ones that went AWOL on it over these past 50 years for a variety of reasons, some of which I've addressed and written about. The population issue became too toxic for them to want to touch, right? The immigration component of it, the abortion component of it, nowadays, the component of it that may even relate to birth control or, women's control over their own bodies and so forth. All of these are contentious issues that environmental groups, be it the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, the Greens, etc., decided that it was best not to touch because they were increasingly politically incorrect or unpalatable, right? And it distracted from their focus on other things like opposing a given dam, opposing a given road, which could yield, especially if you manage to beat those back, could yield immediate benefits, right? The population issue, things changing from 1% a year to 2% a year to maybe 10% every decade, that tends to have slower results. And yet, most environmentalists and certainly most environmental scientists acknowledge that the population issue is one of the major drivers, right up there with affluence and per capita consumption and technology. It just became too easy to sort of sweep it under the rug because of the opposition that it would generate.
Right. I'll just add a sidebar that most religions want growth in their kind, in their flock. And
That's right.
you step on toes unintentionally as an outgrowth of bringing up the topic.
Right.
Okay, next would be Dave Dougherty. You were on deck. I have to go back to see where your question is, but you probably know what it was.
Yeah, I've got it.
Yep.
Okay, so I wonder, are American insurance companies covering the costs of reconstructing buildings or claiming the losses are so-called acts of God? If the costs are being covered, can building owners include fireproofing in their claimed costs?
Yeah, now you're getting into the weeds a bit, Dave. So I mentioned at the outset, I'm not a suburban fire expert. I'm not even a forest ecologist or a climatologist. I do know that the whole issue of insurance is a massive one, and it's already come to the fore in California, with these massive tragic losses in the LA area, especially the two communities of Altadena and Pacific Palisades, where entire blocks, tens of blocks, were virtually wiped out. And the whole people trying to get insurance to cover their losses, and the allegation that the private insurers are attempting to pass cost onto the state. The state of California had apparently established a fund to step in where private insurers no longer would, but there are limits as to what you can do there. And the state itself, I think, fears being wiped out, or this fund being driven into bankruptcy by this. So this is very akin to the issue, also a climate related issue, of hurricanes and hurricane coverage, and what is happening in the state of Florida as the incidence of highly damaging hurricanes increases over the decades. I have a lot of connection with Florida too. I still have a sister who lives there, a niece who lives there. They had to deal with, what was it? I lose track anymore. There are just so many of them. But it's a very similar issue as to public costs versus private costs and limits to both, and insurers ultimately pulling out of areas that, say, barrier islands in Florida, in the case of hurricanes, that should never have been built on in the first place. But on the other hand, there have been homes and infrastructure there for a century or more, right? I don't believe that politically you could just pull out of those areas, but we may not have a choice in the matter anymore. Nature will do it for us. So I'm sorry, I can't give you any specific answers there. These are huge issues, though, and they're only going to be getting more contentious.
Okay,
I
appreciate
neglected
your
to.
answer. Just a second, Steve.
Sure.
Just a quick follow-up on some of your latter comments. Yeah, I mean, if sea level causes an area to be permanently flooded, I think it will eventually have to be abandoned. But
Yeah,
with respect to areas that get repeated fire, in
right.
a drying environment where winds are likely to be more frequent and of higher velocity, does it make sense, whether or not it's covered by an insurance company, to have people rebuilding there? I mean, I went through the flood in Calgary in 2013, and just a few months later, I was down on a river floodplain and I'm an ecologist, by the way. I was able to see where they were already starting to put in new buildings. This is ludicrous.
Yeah. You know, that boy, you touch on something that is just so, I have a hard time wrapping my head around it. What you're saying makes absolute sense, but in the case of a city like Los Angeles, there are literally millions upon millions of homes and people that are at risk because you and I were discussing this yesterday, Dave. Most of the homes in Altadena and Palisades were not didn't catch fire from the flames or the tongues of fires licking them. It was from embers that in these 180 to 100-mile-an-hour winds can be blown miles, right? Now, there are things that you can do in rebuilding a home to make it more fire resistant. There's a lot of things that can be done there, but only so much, and you're not going to entirely eliminate the threat posed. So I don't know that there's an easy answer to this. And what you have said makes sense, but politically, and this is bipartisan, is completely beyond the pale. Of course, people are going to rebuild there, just as they did in your Calgary floodplain. Now, you know, we have a lot of floodplain laws in this country too. The FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, has this famous 100-year floodplains, and it makes it a lot more difficult to build in certain areas. That's all being reevaluated now as a result of climate change and the reality that what was once a 1,000-year flood may become a 100-year flood. A 100-year flood may have a frequency of 10, years or 10% per year, right? So it's similar with the fires. I have a home in Reston, Virginia, which was famously built as a planned community beginning in 1964. We have a lot of woodlands right behind our place. I'm kind of wondering if I'm in a WUI right now. My home's been there half a century, right? And they preserved a lot of woodlands, but there are WUI maps. I'm afraid of actually looking at it, to be honest. And in general, in eastern forests, wildfires aren't the issue that they are in northern and western ones, but is the very first slides I showed you, they can and will happen, just with less frequency.
Oh yeah, I
I was
mean
trying to, I'm
the
sorry, I was
battle of the
trying to alert,
wilderness.
Dave, I was trying,
Steve, please.
no, I was trying
Have
to
extra.
alert Peter McKinnon is on deck, and you wanted me to tell who is on deck, and you were not on deck. But you go ahead and speak.
All right, I'll make this short. The Battle of the Wilderness happened very close to where you are, and the whole thing was on fire. Secondly, there was a place in the Mississippi Valley that was flooded 17 times. And when they got their 17th allocation of federal money to recover from the flood, they decided to move the whole town.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter McKinnon, you're up.
Thank you, Steve. And first off, Leon, that was a fascinating presentation, loaded with lots of interesting facts. One of the things I've been also often fascinated by is the actual temperature of the intensity of heat in fires. And I'm just wondering if you can describe anything about the sort of when it really is hot, like these incredible, explosive fires. How high can the temperatures get? And
Oh gosh.
obviously, I assume it will vary depending on the kind of fuel. So, like a deciduous forest versus a more mixed forest, a taiga forest, or at least a taiga, etc. Just wondering if you can comment on that. Thank you.
The only comment I can give you is that again, that caveat at the start, I can't give you the exact temperature. It does vary a lot. Those low intensity ground fires are much lower. The trees are well adapted to them. Is a lot of the herbaceous layer, right, that can come right back or even requires them. I would say in the thousands of degrees, but I don't, or maybe upper hundreds. It would take a fire expert to give that specific temperature to you, which I can't. But it takes one of those scorching, intense fires to burn through the very thick bark of trees like the sequoias, which have bark inches thick and have fire resistant materials in those bark in that bark, right? It is fascinating to see this. I'm still learning about it, and even fire ecologists are still learning about it, which is why which is why, there's still some disagreement and still some misinformation out there as to the role of fire and what should be done, and still some disagreement among even the experts.
Well, my secondary part of the same question was related to zombie fires. So, in other words, as you know, we have a number of zombie fires seem to spring up pardon the pun, every spring
Yeah,
around Western Canada. And I'm just wondering, again, at the temperature level, these are just smoldering, I guess, just keeping enough oxygen to keep some of that organic material smoldering until
correct.
the snow's
Yeah.
gone.
And all it takes is a few little hot spots like that, right? When you're talking about a fire that is extending across tens of square kilometers, right? It's really hard to, well, people really can't put out every last thing. You depend on the weather, and even those colder winters and the snow or rain precipitation are not enough sometimes if it's well protected and does have enough oxygen to keep on going and smoldering across the winter. We're probably going to be seeing more and more of that.
Do you know if they get zombie fires in the sort of Santa Ana windstorms that you were talking about earlier in California?
I
Because that
haven't
up
heard of
high,
them.
I mean, they come out of the
Yeah,
out of the mountains.
I
The
haven't
winds.
heard of them there.
Okay,
That doesn't mean that they may not occur, but I have never read of them being an issue.
right. Yeah.
They
Thank
may
you very
be.
much.
Again, I'm not an expert, but I've never seen it in my preparation.
Thank you very much. I have another question. I can wait for a turn
Okay,
later. Thanks.
I wanted to tell you that Art Hunter is up next and Madeline Weld is on deck after that. And then David Harris. So that's the sequence I have. And a couple of more questions have appeared. Comments have been explained before are not questions, and they're part of the open discussion that comes after there's no more questions. Okay, so Art Hunter, you're up.
Okay, Leon, fascinating presentation. I really congratulate you on putting this all together in a very useful and meaningful way. My question, of course, is with regards to Donald Trump and what impact his policies are having. I read, bits and pieces of it, but I'd like your view of it all. And some of the material I've read sounds quite alarming. Um, but has any of these policy changes in the environmental world had any impact yet on wildfires? And potentially, what is your prognosis if this is carried forward throughout the Trump administration timeframe?
Wow, where do I start? How long do you have? No, just kidding. A few years ago, I'll give you a bit of a long-winded answer here. A few years ago, during the first Trump presidency, the daughter of a dear Canadian friend, my other major advisor at the University of British Columbia, Irving K. Fox, who used to be vice president of Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C., and founded the Westwater Research Center at UBC. He was one of my other thesis advisors. His daughter, asked me if I was up in arms about the first Trump presidency, and I wasn't happy with it. But I said, look, I and the environment already survived 8 years of Reagan. I've been around the block long enough to know that administrations come and go. These long-term issues, such as climate, such as population, such as growing toxic in the environment, don't. So I'm not going to freak out or hand wave about this administration, although I'm certainly not happy with their environmental policies. Now, I would more or less repeat that now. I'm not happy to see it by any means, but he'll be gone in a few years. Someone like a J.D. Vance comes to replace him, it may be the same. But that doesn't mean that, the Democrats or a Democratic presidency is all hunky-dory on the primary drivers of these sorts of issues either. Now, I do think that under Trump, there are probably cuts to the Forest Service, which are going to reduce, the funding for both personnel, staff to be able to do something about the fire management problem, both in terms of fire suppression and in terms of fire management, that is the sorts of things that cost money, like, thinning, or, the prescribed fire that I mentioned, and so forth. The one area, ironically, where Trump may do some good is by, at least to some extent, slowing US population growth. That is one of the background drivers, by reducing the illegal immigration that had soared under the previous administration. But by and large, when it comes to the environment, especially climate change, and especially NEPA, well, I'll put it this way: the very company that I work for, a federal contractor, uh, had to cut positions, and a lot of the contracts we had with the federal government, assisting federal agencies with their NEPA responsibilities, were eliminated because of this administration. Certainly not happy because of that. Nor am I happy with climate in particular, where there is this feeling, that because it's a hoax, or he doesn't even believe in it, we'll cut funding for these agencies like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or the NASA components that very much study climate and deliver data to us that is very important, not just for Americans, but for people around the world, because of the sheer quantity and quality of it. So that's certainly damaging in the short term. At any rate, I guess I'll stop there for now. By and large, negative. Positive in one way, in terms of reducing the rate of population growth, which is a driver both of environmental problems, greenhouse gas emissions, and increasing the size of the human population and the WUI.
Okay, Madeline Weld, you're up. And
Hi.
David
Hi,
Harries is on
Leon.
deck.
Great to see you again. Haven't seen
Hello,
you in a
Madeline.
long time. So I'm wondering about, with more people, there's also more nutters around. And I remember in 2023, this guy in Quebec, Brian Paré, set at least 14 fires.
Right.
The evacuation of a bunch of places, and he was posting things about, the government setting fires while he was setting fires. And I know there was also some arson in Nova Scotia. And I mean, it's a different situation, but for the I'm going to call it a hoax, the kids buried at residential schools, which turned out not a single body, but I know at least 116 churches were burnt because of that by activists. And you have climate activists throwing paint at Van Gogh paintings and all this sort of stuff. I mean, starting a fire would be a great way to let off steam. And I know it's been mentioned by jihadis as a way to hurt the West, use any means necessary. So that seems, I mean, we're kind of sitting ducks for that, right? As well as for infrastructure. I mean, forest fires, or do you know anything about arson as a
What it, I think in California, at any rate, I don't know, I'm not sure about Canada, but in California, they do to try and determine the cause of every fire, right? A large share of these coastal wind-driven fires are arson. A lot of them are just accidental. The biggest one is power line failure, as I mentioned. But if you shut down your power supply, eliminate electricity, right? Just because of the threat of the Santa Ana wind conditions that can last for 3 days, what does that do to society? So in some places, let me say this: in a lot of Canada and parts of the Western U.S., a lot of the wildland fires are caused by nature, by ignitions from lightning. And in fact, a lot of the more remote ones that you can just allow to burn because they are going to affect so few lives and property, those are caused by natural ignitions, primarily lightning. However, in more human or more populous areas, there's more people at risk because of more people in the WUI, and more people who are bad actors and likely to bring about arson. So yes, there's a lot of variation from place to place as to what the cause of the fires are, how many are natural, how many are human caused, and among the human caused, how many are accidental versus on purpose. I used to hear stories all the time when I was more in the field of firefighters themselves, that is wildland firefighters, starting fires so they could get themselves some work, not because they, hated structures and wanted to burn them down, or were, someone who hates humans or something.
Right. Yeah. because I've seen those videos of Los Angeles with like a lot of homeless people, and you know, I mean, one of them.
Well, those would be urban fires,
that would be urban
as
fires,
opposed to fires starting in the wildland and then moving into urban areas.
have to get
But,
out
you know,
there.
those are an issue too, of course. So
Yeah, yeah,
that's not one that I have been focused on, but,
right.
you know, in any area where you have disaffected people, that's certainly one way to, you know, to get back, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, David Harries, you're up, and John McClintock is on deck.
Well, thank you very much, Leon.
You're
That
welcome.
was a really,
I guess we skipped
yeah,
David Harries.
here I am. I'm sorry. I'm over here in Belgium, and
Oh.
so it was extremely interesting. Now we have outside outside Brussels, where I live, we have a big forest, and it's mainly beech trees, and
Yeah.
it's used by thousands of people at the weekend for bicycling, for walking, for riding horses. Now, they the branches that fall down and the trees which sometimes are blown down in wind by
Right.
the wind, they're left on the ground together with a lot of leaf cover.
Right.
And they're left there to rot and to decompose. And I'm wondering, is that a good idea? Because surely this increases the risk of a fire, because it just adds fuel on the surface of the ground. So is it better to take this, is it not better to take the fallen wood and timber and debris out of the forest and have a clear floor so that you don't have so much fuel lying around in case there's a drought and, you know, and some lightning?
I think it depends on the circumstances. In an urban park or an area where there may be a lot of, again, infrastructure and people at risk, as opposed to a more wild setting, maybe you would want to do that. In wetter areas, certainly the sorts of forests that beeches grow in, beeches are one of the northern hardwoods, right? You would
Yeah.
tend to get decomposition and return of those nutrients to the soil. It's an important part of the recycling that goes on of nutrients and materials and energy in these northern forest ecosystems. But if an area is drying out and under extreme conditions that may prevail more in Belgium in the coming decades as a result of climate change, it may be that you're going to be forced to do something like that because the fire regime, the fire return interval will change, and fires may become more apt to occur in ecosystems where the original fire return interval may have been once in less than a century or something. So I can't answer your question particularly, but it is a serious issue because it is the both living and dead carbon, that matter that accumulating there, that are what forest managers call fuel. And the more of it is, the more tinder there is. And under extreme conditions, which may prevail more in the future, you could be setting that area and those lives and buildings up for serious threats in the future.
Well, thanks, Leon. That's very informative, and thank you very much for your presentation. It was really most interesting.
Thanks, John.
Okay, it seems that David Harries has left, so Karen Schrag, you're up. If you're still here. Well, she might have left as well. Oh no, she's here.
Here.
There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can now, Karen.
Hey, Leon. How are you? Great
Hello,
job
Karen.
as always. I actually, just because of your presentation, I stopped raking my local forest. So thank you. What I want to know is, you know, those of us who are on here on all these really good calls in this wonderful program by CACOR are a pretty much already educated group. But I'm wondering, every time I see, you know, we just had massive wildfires here in Minnesota where I live, and coming down from Canada. Thanks, Madeline. I blame you for that. And there I am. So anyway, what I'm interested in is, every time a meteorologist talks about a wildfire, what could they say to the general public which wouldn't get them fired, that would say, fires due to, or we are seeing an increase in, or what do you think would be like something they could all say, which would elevate the awareness of the general public about why we're getting more and more wildfires, due to all these things, mismanagement and arson and climate change and overpopulation. Is there a way to point them to that direction? Could you suggest a website they go to? I mean, I get so frustrated when they just go, yep, wildfires, like that humans don't have anything to, that whole thing. Could the triangle be put up there? I just wish there was something they could all say. I do know of a meteorologist that was fired for mentioning climate change during his weather report. So
Yeah.
we know that they're scared. Anyway, that's my question.
No, I think well, I don't know about the particulars of that case either, of course, but I think it is possible to address these issues in a non-incendiary way, if I can use that pun, that perhaps may educate the public and let people know that a lot of times there are no easy answers, but there's still things that communities, the state, nations, and individual homeowners ought to be doing, right, as part of fire education. I don't know that the weather forecasters can do that. They tend to be pretty junior folks trying to get out of that position and rise. But there are a lot of valuable educational resources out there online and in other places now. It takes people to avail themselves of it, though. And, local communities, regions, counties, provinces, what have you, to try and do the right thing in terms of educating the public on these long-term trends. I know I see a lot of discussion of it. And it either tends to fall into the we're doomed camp, or, here's what you can do to protect your home, even as the entire neighborhood burns down around you, right? So there are efforts, though, and I saw a documentary on the LA fires just in the last month or two of a group of people, citizen activists, who got together and formed a committee because they felt that the fire department and their towns weren't doing enough. And they fared reasonably well, and they've been helping people through the aftermath. But I don't know that there's any easy way out, and no panaceas or silver bullets in this.
What I just was talking about is, there's access right there. People are going, what's going on with the fires? Because we had to stay indoors for several days because
yeah.
So now people are you've got our attention. What are you going to tell us? That's kind of what I was looking at. Right.
And I think it is getting people's attention. I don't remember, in 2023, the fires that I referred to there, New York City, Hartford, Connecticut, where I was, for example, all the way down to Virginia, where my boys live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. All of those areas were heavily affected. And again, I think it's going to be a learning process. Even the scientists themselves are learning and debating as we go along here. But as with the hurricanes and sea level rise, not just climate things, but other environmental factors, these are things that aren't going away. And I hope we can learn to both try and reduce the impact of these underlying factors, but also get engaged with the necessary adaptation and mitigation that is going to have to happen. And there are hundreds of things that can be done in those regards.
Thank you. Great talk.
Okay, we're just about ready for people that were making comments, but one of the commentators, Jeff Passmore, says he has a question about his comment, so I will let Jeff go, and Anita Thorhog would be next for commentary if she still wants to. And then I see more David Doherty, Ted Manning, Richard Vanderyacht, and I think that will about wrap it up. So Anita, are you there? Well, first Jeff, sorry. Jeff had the comment and he wanted to ask the speaker, Leon, about his response. Well, maybe
Excuse me.
Jeff's
Thank
not
you,
here.
Steve.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So first of all, it's very nice to hear somebody, Leon, who understands the difference between a ground fire and a crown fire, and how all of the problems that have been or not all, but many of the problems that have been created over the last while are as a result of, as you have said, about forest mismanagement. My comment was that there's vast potential for demand on the fuel side of the equation. I put that in the chat, actually. And, the industrial bioeconomy, I don't know if you're familiar with the US Department of Agriculture's BioPreferred program, but there's over 16,000 items in their catalog that are minimum 25% biomass based. So you might have a comment on that. It's a great way to create market pull. Just as an aside, last year at the annual bioeconomy conference I run here in Ottawa, Canada, the chief forester for Renfrew County, which is the largest county in Ontario, was a speaker, and she looked out at the audience and said, please, you guys in this industry are the ones who are going to create demand for all that low-grade wood that we have in Renfrew County. And the forests are going to burn. We just have to decide how. So I thought that it's a wonderful statement. The forests are going to burn. We just have to decide how, and we can add value to these forests and try to somehow. And that's my question to you: how do we better educate those that still go around saying we can't cut down a single tree, including people who work in the Canadian Federal Department of Environment?
Right. Wow. Yeah. This is another deep issue. Here I come from a forestry background, so in part, so I have no problem with cutting down trees and using them in the right way, or using products from the forest, just not every place equally, right? I believe that some areas should be set aside as wilderness. Some areas could be, subjected to certain types of cutting or harvest and so forth. I don't know that I have anything particular to add to what you've just said. I'm broadly supportive of efforts to both learn about and utilize, biofuels. But I don't think I know enough about it to know what some of the controversies are and how I would weigh in on those, even with my background in forestry.
Well, it goes way beyond biofuels. It's the exciting stuff is not really renewable fuels. I mean, maybe sustainable aviation fuels, because planes are trying to figure out how they're going to reduce their carbon footprint. But exciting stuff are the bio-based chemicals to use carbohydrates to reduce all the chemicals that are currently made from petroleum. And that's where you'll see things like paints and plastics and cosmetics and industrial cleaners and solvents and all those other 16,000 items beyond fuels that are on, in the USDA BioPreferred program. Just
Right.
one other quick comment. Dave was talking about insurance. Dave, I put in the note there that you asked who's paying. Well, Munich Re, they suffered $1.3 billion in losses as a result of the LA fires. And as explained to me by one of my friends who works for the Chicago office of Munich Re, we have one of three choices: go out of business, which isn't what we want to do; stop insuring certain projects, which we are doing. They'll no longer insure coal plant facilities or the oil sands, including infrastructure associated with oil sands. And the last one, put up premiums, which of course then in some cases makes projects unfinanceable. So those are their options, and that's the reality we're facing. And insurance companies are struggling with that. And as you probably know, reinsurance companies insure insurance companies. So
Right.
That's who's actually backing all the insurance and who's suffering the losses.
Like Munich Re, I think.
Munich Re and Swiss Re. Yeah,
Yeah.
Munich Re and Swiss Re are the two world's largest. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that comment. Again, I don't have any particular expertise to add to what you've just said, but all of that is related to the theme of today.
And we're not talking about cutting down the cathedral forest on Vancouver Island.
Obviously.
As you say, there are some areas that have to be protected.
Well, when I lived in BC, it was dismaying to see how much of Vancouver Island was already cut down, and they were moving to the north end of the island at that point. And I forget the name of the famous bay where there were so many orcas that congregate. Ropes and Bite, I think is what it was. Or
I don't know.
There was a big battle going on over cutting in the watershed that fed down to that Bite, where more than half of BC's killer whales congregated every summer.
Okay, Anita Thorhog, are you available and interested?
I'm here. there's a big insurance problem happening in the States, and that's these extreme areas, be they hurricane areas, forest fire, floods, and the insurance companies, which of course is a free market situation, are pulling out from certain areas, and insurance premiums for purchasing a house or a building are becoming really tremendously high. And so state by state, they're having big problems with the insurance companies. For instance, in Florida, where I live, there's really only one or two insurance companies that will insure houses near the coastline. So what's going to happen, I think, in the future is that there are going to be areas that are absolutely not insurable unless you're rich enough to buy the whole house all cash, because it will either be a fire hazard or a flood hazard or a hurricane hazard, and you won't be able to afford the insurance that the mortgage companies will insist that you have. So there's a large problem going on in many of the states between the insurance companies, the hazards that are moving ahead due to climate change, and the homeowners.
Anita, you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And I see the parallels with all of these areas that are at risk, that face these hazards, right? Which are growing and intensifying because of climate change. Florida with rising sea level, with the intensity and frequency of hurricanes, areas in floodplains. I mentioned again the phenomenon of 1,000-year floods becoming 100-year floods, and 100-year becoming 10-year flood events, and so forth. And then the risk of wildfire. So how to ensure losses, which can be devastating for a family, right? And tens of millions of them in these situations, has got no easy answer. And this is a very much ongoing and evolving debate within society. And even if you were to pass all costs on to the state, this is what I was saying about California, reading about the controversy there, that is some claiming that the private companies were trying to cap their losses that they were going to insure, right? And pass them on to the state. You know, the state doesn't have endless deep pockets either. So this is what we're all faced with. And almost everyone is exposed to one of these risks, right?
Hey, we're getting down to the last few minutes of our time. I had Dave Dougherty with interest in a comment, also Ted Manning and Richard Van der Yagt, and that's it. So whoever is available, please jump in amongst you three.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly say that I looked up after one of your slides, Leon. You were talking about 2023 fires. 2024 was a continuation of that year in Canada. We had 5,700 fires, and it burned nearly 5.5 million hectares. That's a much smaller area than 2023, which was over 18 million hectares. But 2025 so far, I didn't put this in here, but I did see some information elsewhere. This is an extraordinary year in the United States. So far in Canada, 2,000 fires, and we barely are into the summer, few days. And nearly 4 million hectares burned already. So
wow,
not going to be good. This is why I call it the Pyrocene epic.
Yeah. Part of the Anthropocene, eh?
Okay.
So they actually did not adopt the name Anthropocene, and the name Pyrocene is in the discussion as a possible official title for when we are.
Yeah.
And by the way, when we're talking about climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions from those fires in 2023 exceeded the greenhouse gas emissions from the entire rest of the Canadian economy. Everything from buildings to automobiles, and it's not included in Canada's calculation of its greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
Okay, Ted Manning, are you interested in making a comment at this time?
Yes, I am, and I can go on depending, do we have another speaker? Because I'm gonna have to thank Mr.
Well, there's going to be one more. Richard Vanderyacht had a comment.
Why don't we let him go first, and then I will just run from what I want to
Okay.
say to the thanking.
If he's still available. I have to go through the scroll through here and see if he's still here.
Yeah, I don't see him there.
No, I think he might have split. So carry
Okay.
on, Ted.
In that event, I will proceed right now. Leon, I'm from British Columbia. I was brought up on Vancouver Island in a forest, very near the area you just spoke about. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit is the attitudes of different parts of Canada and the States towards forests are very different. A very specific one just behind me on my screen is Jasper. And I was personally involved in the development of the master plan for Jasper and the park a few years
Jasper
before.
National Park.
Jasper National Park, and
Awesome.
Jasper and the city of Jasper and the conservation strategy for it. We
I love
essentially,
Jasper.
yeah, we spent a lot of time integrating all of the values that people wanted. The one issue we always had was forests, because the problem was it was totally surrounded by essentially almost original forest, some of it and a lot of it replanted. And the big issue was it was a national park. And the fight, politically and otherwise, for touching a single tree in a park, much less creating the kinds of berms that we've been trying to get in around other towns. When we did land use planning, the idea of actually creating buffer zones and all sorts of other things at least was built into it. We couldn't do that here. We were essentially ordered not to do that by the National Park Service, who were not prepared to allow us to sacrifice a park just to preserve the community. So we were really living in a very political environment. It is changing, and I'll just raise one other issue that I put in the chat. My daughter Marianne Armstrong is running a national program for NRC along with several other Commonwealth countries. I think the US is now involved too, on the whole idea of retrofitting all of the planning procedures for housing standards to try and build in climate change. And it is going very well with most of our provinces. Australia is taking it up. Britain and New Zealand are not very far behind. They have, the only issue was my daughter was not even allowed to use the word climate change at a couple of months ago at a conference down in Rhode Island. She was essentially advised, you can talk about anything as long as you don't mention climate change. So it is interesting, to say the least.
Yes.
So that said, I would like to thank you very much for bringing up something that is very current in Canada and the United States. Is really a challenge for the Club of Rome, because the idea is we, like you, wish to sustain the values important to all people. And that does include life and everything else that surrounds it. So I would like to thank you very much. I know you have got people to ask all kinds of questions and definitely kept us all interested. So thank you very, very much. And therefore, I will now move to the commercial and simply say that Andrew Welsh, the president, will probably be coming back doing this more often than me, because I'm now past president, but I'm quite happy to fill in for him, and particularly on one that I'm very interested in like this. So appreciate that very much. We would like to thank you again, and perhaps as things change and as rules change, you may come back and want to talk to us again. Definitely, we would be happy to have you.
Thank you, Ted. And I'd like to thank Steve for suggesting this topic.
Great. No, that's fine. We, as you can see, we have a lot of interesting topics on our website coming up. We have been very fortunate in finding very good people, interesting people, and as a result, our following grows larger and larger all the time on YouTube. So we do apparently have some influence on people, not necessarily always the right people, but on people who at least are seriously interested in saving the planet, in saving their communities, and in living within the limits and limits to growth. So thank you very, very much. And I would ask all of those here who, if you do not belong to CACOR now, please do. If you pay your dues, it allows us to put these on every week, and it also allows us to get these very interesting discussions going to the point where, if we're really lucky, we may actually make a difference. So thanks again, and we will now let you go. Please feel free to put on your audio and video, and we can continue the chat informally, and anything we were afraid to say in front of the spooks, we can now say, because we're turning off the recording.